So, hello from Intellipaat, guys. The topic for today is Java servlets. And before we actually begin, be sure to hit that subscribe button and click on that bell notification icon to never miss out on any updates from us. So, for the agenda today, we have general web architecture. So before we get into servlets, for those of you who are entirely new to web development or any kind of application development, we will look through the general web architecture as to how the system actually works. And then based on that, we will understand what are Java servlets, what are their functions and the basic methods in the Java servlets. Right, then we will understand the Java servlet lifecycle with the how do servlets work, and then finally we will get to the login form, which we will create as an hands-on example with servlets, and I'll explain to you guys how that works. So firstly, let us go to the general web architecture. So within this, we can understand that websites generally operate on a request response basis. Now, what does that mean? So imagine you're working as a client on a client system, right? And you want to access a website or a service that is present on a server, right? So the first thing that you would do is on the website, you will look at the various options that are available to you. So say if you want to evaluate a mathematical equation. So you will enter your parameters, right? For that mathematical equation, you'll click on submit. Yes, I want the answer to this particular equation, right? So that process of submitting is called a request, right? So once you've sent the request, the server will take those parameters in, and based on the algorithm, the server will evaluate that equation. And once the server has evaluated that equation, it'll send a response. It'll generate a response, and that response could be in any format. It could be in JSON, it could be in text format, it's simple message format, right? Any format essentially. Once the response has been generated, it'll go to the web page, and on the web page you can see it. So basically, the response has been sent to the client after the request has been sent. So it usually happens like this: the client sends a request, the server will send a response back to the client. So this is the general web architecture. So there are essentially three elements that you're dealing with over here. So the primary one is the front end, which is over here, which you're seeing, which is the website itself, right? The visual aspect of the website. And the secondary aspect is the logic aspect of the website, which is the server, right? So you don't directly interact with the server. You will see something on the website, right? And on the website, you'll click on something, and based on that click, based on what you've done on the website on the front end, if it's a valid request, it'll basically be sent to the server. And right, and the server will generate a response which it will communicate to you through the front end itself. So this is the medium for communication essentially between the client and the server. And when we move on, we get to Java servlets. There are various technologies all around the world based on the same concept, right? One of them is based on Java, and they are called Java servlets, right? So as the name suggests, they are basically miniature form of actual servers, right? They're pretty easy to build and execute. Essentially, they're lightweight in nature. So essentially, they're defined as web components used to create dynamic web pages, right? So essentially, to substitute for an actual entire server logic, there are many functions that are there that can be done through Java servlets. So let us understand. There are five methods in servlets. So the first is init. Now, init is something that is used to essentially initialize your servlet. So once you've imported the servlet class, you can initialize it by using the init function. Then you have the service function. Now within the service function, you can essentially apply all your logic that you want to use. While the servlet has been initialized, an instance of the servlet has been created, all of the logic part that will be executed will happen within the service function. So, and as long as it is ready, and then finally we get the destroy function. So whenever you want to end the instance of this particular servlet and you want to garbage collect all of the memory that the servlet had been occupying, you'll use the destroy function. There are two additional functions. So one is the get servlet config, which will essentially give you the configuration information of the servlet, and the other is the get servlet info. So it will give you the author of the servlet and any other name details associated to it. So let us understand now how servlets work. What is their life cycle? So essentially what happens is the first thing that you'll do is you'll load the servlet class. You'll import it firstly. So once you've imported the servlet class in your Java program, right, the next thing that you'll do is you'll instantiate that servlet. So you'll create an object out of that class. And once you have created that object out of that class, so you can use that object to initialize your servlets, right? So once you initialize your servlet with the init function, as we discussed earlier, you can actually start with your logic. So when you initialize it and the initialization is successful, the servlet goes into ready state. Now, this is an infinite state as long as the instance of this particular servlet is running, right? So what you can do now is use the service function, the service method, and it can be called as many times as needed to execute as many aspects of the logic as are needed. And once the function of the servlet has been fulfilled, this instance is no longer required. You can essentially call the destroy function, which is called to basically garbage collect all of the memory that the servlet had been occupying and to essentially shut the servlet down. So this is how the servlets function, right? So let us see the practical implementation of these servlets. We are going to be building a login form where we are going to be entering two fields, which is the user ID and the password. And if the password and the user ID match with a pre-existing user ID and password, we are going to redirect our client to the successful login page, or we are going to redirect them to the unsuccessful login page. So let us see how that would work in the Java Servlet environment. And before we actually begin, we need to understand two terminologies as well. So the first terminology is the get. Now, get is a method that is present in servlets and in various other web technologies as well, where you're essentially sending limited amounts of data through your URL itself. So you might have noticed whenever you search on Google something, right? You enter some search key term on Google and you search it. So it gives you something like this, right? So you have these variable names that are present in your URL, right? And they are equal to a certain value, which is your search term to be precise. So that is the kind of URL that you get whenever you press enter after hitting search or on a Google search form. Right, so this is what you get. This is the get method. Google essentially is using the get method in that particular job, right? And there's also the post method where you can send more amount of data, right? You can send enormous amounts of data using post. You can send large amounts of data, but the data is not actually visible in the URL. So you're essentially redirecting yourself to a page where the data is existing, but in the URL itself, you cannot see the data, right? So that is when you are using the post method, when the data needs to be hidden and it's not exactly present in the URL. So once we've understood that, we can move on to our example. So as you guys can see, I currently have my Eclipse IDE open, right? So the first thing that we need to do is create a dynamic web project. So firstly, I'll go to File, I'll click on New, and then I'll go to Dynamic Web Project. So within this, we can name our project anything. So since we are creating a login form, I'll call this login form. And then I have to select a container on which my server is going to run. So the current container that has been selected is Apache Tomcat 8.5, which I have in my C drive, and I have configured the location to that particular folder. So once I have configured that, I'll go to next, and then I'll go to next again, and then I'll click on generate web XML deployment descriptor. Now what this will do is it'll generate a descriptor, an XML file by default. So I'll click on that and click on finish. So currently we can see that we have our project ready, and then we can create our code files within this. So there are essentially two aspects to every web application, the front end and the back end. The back end is where the logic happens, and the front end is what you see on the screen, right? So right now we have this folder called Java resources. We don't need to concern ourselves with the JavaScript resources because we are not creating a project in that. So in the Java resources, we can see that there are two folders, SRC and library. So if we have to add any additional libraries, we can add it in the libraries folder and import the modules from there. But for now, the servlets that we will create and any other Java modules that we will create that have logic in them will go within this SRC folder, right? And the front end will go in the web content folder. Now within web content, if we simply expand this, we can see we have the meta INF, web INF. We don't need to concern ourselves with that particularly right now. We'll just click on web content, right click on it and go to new and go to JSP file, right? So we'll just name this file something relevant. So let us call this login and .jsp and click on finish. So when we do that, within the web content folder, we have the login.jsp file. So since JSP files are something that the user sees, which gets rendered on their web browsers, the format is almost identical to HTML, right? So we can see the HTML doc type over there and the head, which basically would have the title in it, and the body over here where we can add the body, right? We can do all of that. So basically, in the body, we can get started with something. We want to create a login form, right? So we need two input fields and we need a submit button to basically submit those two input fields in order to basically log into our website, whatever we are creating right now, right? So since we are not connecting any databases to this project, we wouldn't be actually creating a registration page where we'll take some data and register it onto our database for login authentication. Right now, we'll just create a login page. So first thing that we would do is create a form. Now form is something that is inbuilt in the HTML. So I'll simply create a form and create a method within that form. So the method, as we discussed earlier, describes the post or the get, whatever we are using this particular field for, right? So for instance, we are going to be using the post method over here, and the action basically determines where we are going to redirect once the submit button has been clicked on this form. So we are going to go to something, let us call this login authentication, right? So this is going to relate to the logic part of things where we have the logic files in our Java folder, in the Java resources folder, right? So there will be a file called, let's say, login authentication. It's going to go redirect over there and check whether the credentials are correct or not. So we double quote close this and we close the form, right? Now within this, below this, we can basically create a table. So I'll just put an enter over here and create a table. So tables are pretty easy to create in HTML as well. So once I have created the table, within the table's body, I'll first create the first input field, and we are going to call this the ID input field, where you're going to enter your unique email ID or your unique user ID essentially. So let us create that first. So within this, we can name it anything. So let us call this ID. So this will appear on the web page as ID, uh, adjacent to that particular input field. And then we'll close this. So once we've closed it, actually it automatically did that. So once we close that, we'll create the field that we need. So to create the field, I'll simply create another cell block over here, and given the criteria of input, so input type, firstly I have to specify the type. So I want it to be in plain text because there is no hiding going on over here in the user ID input part. So I'll just add text over there, and the name, let us call this something like user ID, right? So this is what we'll refer to this particular input field as when we go to the logic part where we need the value extracted out of it. And then finally we'll close this. So it automatically closed itself. And then we'll close this particular row as well. So it automatically closed itself as well, right? And the next thing that we need to do is create the password field. So we'll just copy this first, right? Because we want to create something identical below as well. So we'll just paste it over here. Instead here, we'll just call this password. And in type, I'll change it from text to password. So now, whenever I type the password in this particular input field, it'll appear hidden, right? In the form of asterisks or those black dots that you see, right? So basically hidden so that nobody else behind you can see, essentially. So in the name, I'll call this variable, so to speak. Let us call this pass, right? So once I have done that, I'll just create the submit button. So once you've entered that, you'll obviously need the submit button. So let us create that as well. So I'll just copy this and paste it over here. So since we don't need a name on the submit or adjacent to the submit button, because the submit button will already have the text submit on top of it, so we'll just simply delete this. So we don't need that. And what we'll do now is change this input type to submit. So it'll automatically be a button. And then we'll simply, in the value, we'll put it as, and name this as login. So once we have done that, we have our JSP page over here. So we're just going to save it, right? So now we can go to the logic part. So let me remind you over here again that in the action of this particular form, so once I click on the submit button right over here, what I want to do is initiate this action. It means that I want to redirect myself to the login authentication post method. So I'm just going to create a servlet now. So once I go to the Java resources, right? So within here, I'll go inside this src folder and I'll right click on it. So within this, I'll click on new. I'll go to new and I'll click on servlet. So here we can see we get the basic configurations for our servlet. So in the Java package, I'll simply leave it empty because I'm not actually putting my class into any particular package. But in the class name, I'll make sure that I enter this particular action text, that is login authentication, so that it actually maps to it. So login authentication, right? It has to be case sensitive as well. So once I have done that, I can simply remove the space over there and it'll allow me to finish. So I'll click on next, right? And we can see the URL mapping over here. It's going to redirect to slash login authentication whenever that particular action is prompted. And then I'll click on finish, right? So right now I have my servlet created for me. So we can see the name over here at the at web servlet, which is slash login authentication. And within this, we can see a variety of methods, which is the do get and do post, right? Which are the methods that we are currently concerned with, because right here we can see that there is this post method that we are going to be prompting whenever we click on the submit button. So whenever we click on that, it will redirect to this particular servlet and it will redirect to this particular method, right? So whatever we write within this method, that logic is going to be implemented upon clicking the submit button. So the first thing that we are going to be doing in our do post method is remove the default text that is present over there. So we'll just remove the comment and the do get method, right? So once we have done that, what we can do is retrieve the text field values from our JSP page. So we can see that whenever the user enters an ID and a password, the names that are corresponding to those fields are user ID and pass. So these are the names that we are currently concerned with. So what we will do is we'll create two string values to basically store each of them. So firstly, I'll create string and I'll call this ID, and then I'll equate it to request dot get parameter, right? So whenever I type that request dot get parameter, I can simply add the exact field that I am looking for particularly. So in this particular case, the field that I am looking for is just a moment, wait a moment, user ID. So I'll simply add that over there, user ID. And within this string pass, I'll add request dot get parameter, and I'll add pass, right? So when I do that, I'll simply, as firstly, I'll change this to something else. ID seems to be a keyword, so I'll change this to user ID. I think that can work, right? So once I have done that, I can simply add this over there and add a semicolon at the end of it, right? So once I have done that, I can carry on with my particular statement. So what if the user has entered these particular fields and now we have to check whether these fields exist in our database or not. So basically what we'll check first is if the user ID is correct, right? So if user ID dot equals, and here we can enter. So right here we can just simply remove this and enter equals. We don't need content equals, and enter something like let us call this Ryan, right? So user ID dot equals Ryan. So if in our database, in our hypothetical database, let us assume that there is only one data record which has the user ID Ryan, and let us create a password as well. So pass dot equals, so it automatically somehow translates to content equals. I'll just remove that, and password equals, let's call this pass 123, right? So this is the password that the user ID Ryan should have, right? That is present in our database. So right now what we can do is give some conditions for each of these particular conditional statements, right? So for each of these conditions, if the user ID and password are correct, and if they are not correct, we have to create two web pages where we can redirect our user to, right? So for instance, right over here, we have our login page that is currently created. We have to create two more pages, right? So the first page that we will create is for the case when our user ID and password actually match and the individual is able to log in. So successful login, let us call this particular JSP page that, and create it. So the first page is called successful login. And within this, we can simply give one H1. So for instance, our H1 can be uh, you have successfully logged in. And then we can create a page that indicates a an unsuccessful login, so to speak, right? So I'll save this first over here. I'll save this first, and I'll go to login authentication. I'll make changes to that later. So the next page that I'll create is I'll go to new and click on JSP file, right? And I'll call this unsuccessful login. So I think that can suffice. right? I think that works, and call it .jsp. Click on finish, right? And within this, we can give some sort of a value. So here, let us give some title, like over here. We have given insert title over here. I'll simply remove this from here. I'll remove the title to something like successful login. Right, I think that works. And over here, we can give the title unsuccessful login. And within this body, we can give an h1 and call this h1 your user ID or password is incorrect. Right? So this will be the text that will be presented to the user on the web page if the user has entered the wrong credentials, right? And I'll save this as well. So we have successfully created our two JSP pages that we are going to be using when the password is correct and when the password is wrong. So when I go to the if statement over here, I'll obviously open up a curly bracket, right? And within this curly bracket, we have to give the condition when it's correct. So for the if condition, what we'll give, so here we'll be using a function which is called as send redirect. So as we can see in the two arguments that we are receiving in this particular do post method, one is the response method and one is the request argument, not the method, the arguments that we are receiving. So from the request, we receive the parameters, but in the response, we can basically decide what we can do after we have received the parameters, after the logic part of this particular. We are going to use response dot send redirect, which is going to give us a prompt to enter a location as an argument. So here we can simply open up double quotes, and as a string value, we can pass the name of the JSP page where we want to redirect in case the condition is true. So we want to redirect to successful login, right? And .jsp. So it's important to specify the extension of the file, and then once that has been done, so this becomes correct, and then we go to the else statement, and within the else statement we don't have to specify any condition. It's just in the case where any of those particular conditions are not true, the password equality and the user ID equality. And here we do something similar. We call response.send redirect, and we enter the page name that we want. So in my case, I want unsuccessful login or JSP. I close my double quotes over there. And once I have closed my double quotes, the program is ready. I'll just put a save over here and see if there are any errors that are persisting. So I'll look at this error just a moment. So yeah, so there was one bracket that was missing. Now that bracket has been entered, and I'll save this so that frees our program, our project from any errors. So let us now run this. So running this is quite simple actually. We'll simply have to go to the project name. We go to run as, and we go to run on server. This is not a Java application that we're running. We're actually running a server. So I'll simply save this again and simply go to that again and go to run as and run on server, right? So when we go there, it prompts us the option. What do we want to use? We want to use the Tomcat 8.5 server. So we have already selected that, and we'll click on next, and we'll click on finish. So we can see our server has started running. So since we haven't configured an index for our website, we are not initially redirected to any particular web page. So I'll just simply add a address over here, which is called login.jsp, and I'll press enter. So when I press enter, we can see that we are actually redirected to a web page like on the local host 8080, which is on my local server. And in the ID, the first thing that I can try is enter Ryan, and in the password I can enter pass123, and I'll click on submit query. So it prompts us with you have successfully logged in with the title successful login. And on the other hand, if I simply go back over here to login.jsp and I enter Ryan, but I enter the password which is correct 123, and I click on submit query. So it gives us the unsuccessful login.jsp. So currently I think I did not have my name configured properly. So I'll just fix that and it'll be resolved. So yeah, so there were two L's in the unsuccessful login. So if I simply go back to my login authentication.java and I put in two L's over there, which is incorrect spelling, by the way. So if I put that over there and save it, right? And then what we can do is stop the current execution of the server. So we can simply go to the server and click on stop, the square button over there, and then we can rerun this entire program, right? So I'll close these web pages up and go to login form, and I'll click on run on server. I'll click on next and finish. It opens up a web page again. I'll click on login.jsp. I enter that. I enter Ryan and a password that is incorrect 1234 and click on submit query. So here we can see your user ID or password is incorrect, and that is how servlets work essentially. So the servlets deal with the logical aspects of things, and the JSP files, which are optional by the way, you can use other front page format as well, like HTML directly you can use that. But with JSP, we get a lot more features that are compatible with servlets. That is why we use them in combination to them. So I hope that was a wonderful experience for you as a tutorial. Now we are at the end of our session. If you liked what you saw, you can give us a like on this video. You can also contact our course advisors if you're interested in any of our courses. They are available 24/7. You can use the following contact details for India and the US. You can also contact our sales team via mail, right? So if you want to join us for these live sessions and ask us live doubts from the trainers and from the course advisors regarding career opportunities or the technical aspects of things, you can join up on our webinar. The link for the webinar has been provided to you in your YouTube chat box. So you can look over that and you can join us on our webinar. You can sign up for them and you can ask us live doubts. So with that out of the way, we are at the end of the session. So hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you from Intellipaat and goodbye.